For most of my school career, I had 100% attendance. Through a weird mixture of being cautious and carefree, I ended up with a strong immune system, and my lack of enthusiasm for outdoor activities meant that I rarely got injured. It was, then, a painful surprise when I first injured myself properly. It was the evening after my 9th birthday party, which was held in June, more than 2 months after my actual birthday. My parents had organised a picnic on Combe Hill, a scenic viewpoint to the monument only a couple of minutes from home, setting up a scavenger hunt and a few other activities to entertain the dozen or so kids that came. It was a fun event on a warm day and, to celebrate a successful operation, my parents called into a pub on the way home. Have either of you ever been to the Styland Fence? It's on the road between Weybridge and Riscombe Down, maybe 2-3 miles away from here. It's always been a favourite of my family, for the cheap drinks as much as the good quality food. Growing up, though, I most of all appreciated the garden. To one side, there was this huge aviary populated with dozens and dozens of cheeping budgies, lovebirds and parakeets. I personally always thought that the best animal there was Roscoe, a big, mean cockatoo who loved to preen and strut in front of delighted guests like me, almost as much as he liked to bully the other birds stuck in the cage with him. Eventually, though, he was moved to a new cage to spare his colleagues and, more recently, a change of owners meant that all the birds had to be rehomed. What is still there, though, opposite the empty bird cages, is the playground. It always was a good one. The area was dominated by a colossal plastic and fiberglass monstrosity that rose out of the wood chips and into a tree, complete with fake leaves, cartoonish, terrifying dryad smile, and a little hidden area in the centre of the fake tree trunk. I used to really enjoy the slide in particular, more like a water park flume than the common straight-line playground affair. The enclosed, greeny turquoise tube had plenty of twists and turns. It may even, if I remember correctly, have had a loop. Horizontal, not vertical though. It wasn't that extreme. There was also a little obstacle course consisting of a climbing frame and webbing, with a fireman's pole thing for sliding down. There was a sign at the entrance saying that all children should be supervised and that the pub wasn't responsible for any injury, but my parents seemed pretty relaxed about the whole thing, and would often go and sit at a table to drink while letting me do my own thing. Not to say they were neglectful or anything, of course, far from it. They just, trusted me. The one area I tended to stay away from, though, was the monkey bars. I've never been great with upper body strength or heights, and their combination in this challenge was just too much for me. On that day, though, buoyed by my newfound nineness and tempted by the self-satisfaction that doing the handlebars would give me, I gave them a shot. I fell at the first rung. To an onlooker, I'm sure it would have looked pretty funny to see me reach out for that first handle, think I'd grabbed it, then fall flat on my face. I'd probably have laughed it off, nothing hurt but my ego if that had been the case, but I didn't exactly fall flat. One of my feet had snagged in the ladder up to the bars, and I'd twisted as I'd fallen, landing awkwardly on my outstretched arm. The pain was near unbearable to me. Really, it was only a minor sprain, but I was naive and young, and to me it was as bad as if I'd broken something. Gently prodding the inflamed flesh, I remember wincing back tears and staggering back to the welcoming embrace of my only slightly tipsy mother. So, when you ask me for my scariest memory, that's one that first comes to mind. That first spike of true fiery pain, deeper than any minor scrape or graze, honestly frightened me. That isn't exactly the most frightening story I have, though. It's just the scariest that I care to think about. Remember how I said that I had nearly 100% attendance? That's technically true, but I wasn't invulnerable to sickness. A couple of times a year I'd wake up in the middle of the night and rush downstairs to vomit in the toilet, before being declared fit to go to school the next morning. On one particularly memorable occasion, my parents thought I was alright and sent me in, but I was promptly returned home when I threw up on Bryce Martin's shoes halfway through DT. That's a different story though. Still, I have one memory of being properly ill. I was 7 or 8 and it was a Friday in mid-December, only a couple of weeks before school split up for Christmas. I woke up with a killer headache, but, wanting to keep my attendance record, I struggled into school. I have to say, that was a pretty shit day. I spent the whole time basically hating everyone for everything, which, given that I was only a kid, basically meant a lot of tantrums and not very intelligent answering back. When the day finished and the teachers finally packed me off on the school bus, they probably did so with a sigh of relief. Normally, I'd have had music lessons on Friday evening, but it was obvious to my parents that I was in no fit shape to go play brass for an hour. When I got home and off the bus, I crawled into bed and slept fitfully, finally giving up on rest at about 4 in the morning. I wasn't in a good way. I swung out of bed and, taking the duvet downstairs, sat on the sofa in front of the TV. When I turned it on, it was showing telly shopping, and I just sat there, blanketed, not bothering to change it. I kept shivering those weird, warm shivers that you always get when ill. I made it through maybe half an hour before realising something. Not only was I exhausted, I was ravenous. I hadn't eaten anything since lunch the previous day, and, besides, I'd only managed to swallow a mouthful or two before giving up. I crept into the kitchen and, not bothering to turn on the light, reached up and opened the fridge. There on the bottom shelf, right at eye level with me, was a sandwich in a Ziploc plastic bag. There was a post-it note on the bag, and there, handwritten, a message, saying, "Jethro, eat me." It was followed with a neat X written in purple pen. I didn't need to be told twice, and, returning to the sofa, wolfed down the sandwich. Maybe it was just because I was tired and ill, but man, it was a really good sandwich. Soothed and sedated, I returned to the sofa and fell asleep again, lulled by the voice of an excited man advertising a mop on the TV. When I awoke, I felt worse. Not vomity or anything, but just worse. This dull ache was pervading my whole body, and I could barely move. I glanced at my little green lizard-themed wristwatch, and saw that the time was 6:30, still a little time before my mum would be up. Luckily, the TV was still on. Once the infomercials were over, it turned out that I was watching the History Channel. I don't really know why, because no one in my family was hugely into history, but that morning, I loved it. I watched shows about the Tudors, Vikings, ancient Greeks, and lapped it up. Somewhere in the middle of the show about medieval Italy, my mum came downstairs and offered to prepare me some breakfast. I thought it was slightly odd, given that she'd already made the sandwich for me, but I had to decline now that I was too ill to swallow. "It's a shame," Mum sighed, laying a hand on my brow to check the temperature and grimacing at the heat. "Have you looked outside?" I shook my head. She threw the curtains open, and I groaned. For the first time that year, thick, heavy snow was falling outside. I watched as clumps as big as my fist slowly dropped from the dark grey skies above onto a dense coat already covering the garden. After lunch, which I again dodged, I began to realise that my mum was becoming increasingly anxious. My dad was on a business trip, some management course up north near Manchester, and had called a few times to tell my mum that the train home was delayed and, eventually, that the train was cancelled and he'd take a replacement bus. Mid-evening, another call came through telling her that the bus had gone off the road about half an hour's drive from home and that he'd need to be picked up. My mum, apologising, left to go get him, promising to be back within an hour despite the weather. I don't know why, but at the time, the History Channel were doing some weird run of programmes, sort of like Shark Week, but centred around cannibals. The big special feature that they were building to was a show about an archaeological dig from the previous summer at the site where the Donner Party were snowbound, complete with shocking new evidence showing what had gone on there. There was still another day until they showed that, though. What I was watching when my mum left was a documentary about Alfred Packer. Have either of you heard of him? Packer was an American pioneer in the 19th century who, after hiking across the mountains of Colorado and coming out the other side as the sole survivor of his party, claims that the other 5 members killed each other for food and admitted to eating the flesh of the corpses to survive. As you might expect, the History Channel telling of this story was a little more sensational than mine. It depicted in horrible detail the conditions in the Rockies during winter, and by the time the men turned on each other, the desperation of their situation felt real. There was one image that I knew would stick with me as soon as I saw it. The documentary went to great lengths to show a realistic butchering of the first person Alfred ate. I could only watch with horrified fascination as the man's dark green shirt was cut away from his blotchy, purple-patched skin. With great fervour, Alfred then sliced open his stomach and pulled out his organs, starting with his dark, purple liver. The camera followed his blood-soaked hands as he lifted the flesh to his mouth and, grinning with satisfaction, sunk his teeth into the raw meat. He took another bite, a single drop of blood trickling down his chin, and then the TV turned off. It wasn't a huge surprise, but it did unnerve me a little. We're out in the sticks a bit, so power cuts aren't uncommon when it snows heavily. Besides, I was now almost too ill to move, so there wasn't really much I could do other than sit tight, burrow into the warmth within my duvet, and wait for my parents to come home. All evening, I'd been getting worse. The shivers had become a deep, numbing chill, despite the fact that I could feel how hot my hands and head were, and had drenched my pyjamas with sweat. I checked my watch. My mum had been gone for 45 minutes and, with any luck, would get home soon. Outside the window, I heard a crunch. Immediately, and perhaps irrationally, I felt a wash of fear permeate out from within me, and I shivered once more. I held my breath and listened. There was another, then another, then another. The footsteps were coming closer until they stopped and I heard 3 quiet, quick knocks on the window. I pretended not to hear, but strained to see outside. It had grown dark, especially given the snow and the clouds that had yet to fall, but I could see a silhouette against what blue light remained. The shadow's arm came up to the window again and knocked 3 times more. All of a sudden, the lights came back on and illuminated the man outside. Alfred Packer was at the window. Even as my mind raced, turning the information over and over in my hot little skull, explaining that it couldn't be, that he'd died over a century earlier, there he was. I could even see that same blood trickling down from the corners of his mouth, the starvation clutching his skin in close to his bones. I couldn't hold back the fear anymore, and let out a whimper which, somehow, the cannibal heard. Knowing that I'd spotted him, he grinned ravenously at me and moved towards the front door. I couldn't move. Maybe it was fear or the illness, but for some reason, as I heard him scratch at the door, I had no way to fight back except to scream loud. I knew that my parents weren't here to help, but I had neighbours on both sides, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to alert them. I shut my eyes tight against the horror outside, and prepared for the worst when I heard the door swing open. Somehow, I'd missed the crunching sound of the car as it parked outside. As my mum strode into the room and swept me into a hug, I couldn't help but cry with relief. My dad came in just after her, looking concerned, and made me tell him what happened. He listened to me, but when I mentioned the cannibal and how I'd seen the blood on his face, he seemed all too ready to write it off, at the very least as a fever dream, and, at most, me lying to grab more attention. While I was aware that I couldn't have actually seen a 200-year-old man-eater prowling around outside, I knew that I'd seen something and begged him to take a look. While my mum still clasped me to her, my dad went outside with a big black mag light just to check, at my mother and I's insistence. When he came back in, he was paler than the snow on the shoulders of his black coat. He brushed it off and called my mum through to talk to him. He told my mother that there were tracks in the snow outside, and went and punched 3 digits into the phone before requesting the police. My mum left me for a second and, putting her shoes back on, went to take a look for herself. When she came back in, she clutched in her hand a purple marker pen.